Some time ago, when I was in Rome, I was invited to a parish church outside of Rome, and I was invited to attend an evening vigil mass. And the priest who invited me was the pastor there. And the gospel for that Sunday was on the gospel of the rich man and the poor man, Lazarus, found in the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 16, verses 19 to 31. Now, the pastor there preached a beautiful homily about the rich man and about Lazarus and about our duty and our need to help those who are poor and those who are in need. He stated that it was our obligation and responsibility to help those who are poor and in need. And in his parish in particular, there was a gypsy camp close by. There was a gypsy camp, and so he preached this homily, and everyone was touched by it, everyone was moved by it. And on the way out of church, as we exited, then everyone else exited, there were a swarm, a lot of gypsies coming up and begging for alms. And I can see everyone just opening their pockets and dropping in coins because they felt so bad, right? They felt, this story of the rich man and Lazarus, I got to help out the poor. But then for the pastor, however, I've noticed he had it had a different effect. He meant to talk about helping those in need, but then he knows the gypsies and he knows them very well. And so, he says, all right, well, next Sunday, I'm going to preach about justice and the wrath of God, right? And I wasn't there around for that. But I thought that's a very interesting story because, yes, it's our duty and our obligation to help the poor and those in need. Now, of course, there are going to be people who take advantage of the situation or who are not always genuine or who are not always honest, right? We let God be the judge of that. But I think very clearly, though, here in the parable of the rich man and the poor man named Lazarus, there are some very important lessons we can draw from this very parable. It's a very beautiful parable. And here I'd like to share six very important lessons we can draw from this parable right here. Lesson number 1. The rich man was in a position to help the poor man, but he chose to do nothing. Take a look at the parable once again, right? Have you been in a position where you are able to help somebody, but you decide, I'm not going to help that person, right? Because of selfish reasons, or because it's not convenient for us, or because we don't want to, right? All these things can happen. Now, think about it. The rich man knew that the poor man was there. He knew Lazarus was at his doorstep. In fact, Lazarus was at his doorstep for the rest of his life. This rich man chose to do nothing. And that's something very important here. He failed. He failed because he's in a position to help, but he chose to do nothing. That's point number 1, right? Point number 1. Point number 2, we see the reversal here, right? The rich man then was in a position to no longer be able to help, but he's in a place where he needed help. Take a look. So after both of them pass away, right? The poor man Lazarus passes away. He dies, in other words. And then the rich man dies. And see where they both end up, right? And the rich man ends up in a place of torment. And he looks out to Lazarus and he says, help me. Now, here's something very interesting. His whole life, this rich man chose to do nothing for Lazarus. And now that he's in a position where he needed help, he's asking for help. That's something very interesting here because my first 2 points, he was in a position where he could help, but he chose not to. And then later, he's in a position not to help, but that he needed help and that he's asking for help. Now, take a look at these two together and look at your own life. Maybe, for example, you have a neighbor who's asking for help, but for whatever reason, maybe it's not convenient, maybe you don't like your neighbor, maybe something else, right? You decide not to help that person. But let's imagine for a moment, a month down the road, 2 months down the road, when you need help. Would you walk to your neighbor then and say, neighbor, I need some help, right? You said no to him 2 months ago, a month ago, whatever, right? Now, would you, ask your neighbor, right? And the other question is, would your neighbor help you? So I think in both of these lessons here, it's very important to be attentive, right? To be attentive to our needs and to be attentive to the needs of our neighbor, and to recognize these 2 points. That's very important. Let's move on to point number 3. Point number 3, where did the rich man go? where did the poor man go? Right? Poor man Lazarus. I think the parable makes it abundantly clear for us, right? The Lazarus ends up in the place where Abraham's at, whereas the rich man ends up in a place of torment. And now I think this point is really important because, I've sat down with others who study the Bible, etc., and they are very uncomfortable with this point. They said, well, you know what? The rich man really didn't do anything. He didn't commit any grave sins, and that is true. If you take a look at the laws, right? If you take a law of the Jewish laws and the prophets in particular, technically the rich man didn't really break any laws, right? But if you look even deeper, he broke the greatest law of all. That is to love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, to love others. The rich man completely failed to love others. And that's where he ended up in the place of torment. Now think about this again. He didn't hurt the poor man. He didn't harm him. He didn't do anything bad. But the fact that he chose to do nothing tells you, his lack of love for his neighbor. Number four lesson we can learn here in this parable is our need to help other people. Now, think about this greatest commandment again, right? Love God from your heart, love your neighbor as you would yourself. Now, these two commandments sound very easy in words, but in reality, they are very difficult to do, right? They're very difficult to put into action. The question is, if you're in position to help others, and sometimes it will be inconvenient, will you be willing to help this person? Because as Jesus tells us, by helping the least of your brothers, you are doing it to me, right? That's what Jesus tells us. So it's a reminder to us to help others too. Number five, warning to others about the place of torment, right? Look at the parable some more and read on further, and you see this dialogue between the rich man who's in place of torment and Abraham. This rich man is begging for help, and Abraham says, sorry, can't help you. And then this rich man says what? He says, well, if that's the case, then can you send someone who's from the dead back to life to warn of others so that they don't end up in the same place like me? And what does Abraham say? Well, they have the law and the prophets. If they don't listen to those things, then, well, they won't listen if someone from the dead comes back either, right? So point number five is a great warning for all of us. Look at our own lives. Are we loving our neighbor, right? Are we loving our neighbor as ourselves? Or are we like this rich man? And I think this is a really important thing, because if you zero in on the whole story, the whole parable that unfolds, this is the key right here. To focus in our lives, yes, but to focus on loving others. This is so important, which then leads me to point number 6. And the final lesson we can learn from this parable here. Point number 6 is this. The choice is yours. The choice is yours on where you want to go for all eternity. Where do you want to go? Do you want to go to a place of torment, or do you want to go to a place where Abraham's at and where Lazarus is at, etc., right? And so again, it's a great reminder to us that what we choose to do with our lives here in this world will have consequences for all of eternal life. So this is something very important for us to reflect upon. When we see those in need, for example, do something about it. When we see our neighbor who's in pain, who needs help, do something about it. Unless we become like this rich man who is so blinded by the reality of life that he only focuses on himself, that he forgets about everyone else. Now, if that's the case, and he failed to love his neighbor, or we fail to love our neighbor, then we'll end up in the same place where he ends up. So the choice truly is yours. So here you have it again. 6 important lessons from this parable right here. Let me quickly summarize. The rich man was in, number 1, the rich man was in a position to help, but he chose not to help. Number 2, the rich man no longer was in a position to help, and he was begging for help. Notice the reversal here. Number 3, where the two of them end up, right? One in place of torment, one in a place of eternal happiness. Number 4, our need to help others. Number 5, the warning, right? Warning in your own life. Make sure you love your neighbor, make sure you love God. And then number 6, the choice is yours. May God bless you.